Hey everybody, happy Monday. This is 3 News Now. I'm Stephanie Haney. This is where we give you your top headlines, trending topics, and everything we're working on for you right now ahead of our 6 p.m. What Matters Most, 7 p.m. Front Row, and 11 p.m. What's Next TV shows. It is a very happy Monday here on Monday, November 18th, 2019. We've got lots of great stories for you today. First up, we're going to take a look at how the U.S. Postal Service is making it easier to get an answer to your letter to Santa Claus for people living in Cleveland as part of something called Operation Santa. Then we're going to take a look at the Russo brothers, who are not taking any flack from Martin Scorsese. They have responded to criticism from him. We'll take a look at what they said. Then our sports analyst Ben Axelrod will be joining us. He's going to give us the latest on the Myles Garrett suspension, as well as tell us why the Browns-Steelers game that's coming up in 2 weeks on December 1st got moved to 1 p.m. when it was supposed to happen later in the day. And then this is a very big week as well with those impeachment inquiry hearings. We're going to take a look at what you can expect this week on those hearings, which are happening Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. And finally, we're going to end on a happy note. We're going to give you your source of Monday motivation with our segment called We Know You Can. All right. First up, we're taking a look at how the U.S. Post Office will be posting letters to Santa Claus sent from Cleveland as part of something called Operation Santa. I'm going to drop the link to that story right here in the comments for you right now. If you live in Cleveland and you're writing to Santa Claus this year, there's a good chance that you might get a response to that letter. It might not come from the big guy, but you might get a response nonetheless, because the U.S. Postal Service gets tons of letters every single year addressed to Santa Claus, so they've decided to do something about it. Now, most of those letters, the post office says, will ask for toys and games, but some of those letters will ask for things that are just basic necessities or for help for themselves or loved ones. The letters can come from an individual or a family, and starting this year, the post office is adding letters from Clevelanders to the ones posted online. Last year they did this as part of Operation Santa, and it included 7 cities. This year it will include 17. One of those 10 new cities is the city of Cleveland. And the way this works, the reason why these people will be more likely than they otherwise would be to get an answer to those letters is because these letters can be adopted by people who can respond and then fulfill the wish that is requested in those letters. Previously, and still today, postal workers do respond as they have time to the letters, but now they're opening this up to people from the city of Cleveland, to people all over online. Anyone can do it, but the city of Cleveland letters originating from here will be included on the website. But don't worry, I know people are probably concerned about privacy and if there's an issue with children's safety, if your address will be given to the people who are fulfilling the wishes that are requested in these letters, but that's not the case. The name and address of the person who wrote in to Santa Claus, as well as the person who fulfills the wish, is protected, so you don't have to worry about that. Now, if you want to send Santa a letter, this is very important if you want to participate in Operation Santa. Santa has a new address specifically for this purpose. You can think of it as maybe Santa's P.O. Box direct to Operation Santa. The address is Santa Claus, 123 Elf Road, North Pole, and that zip code is 88888. Again, that's Santa Claus, 123 Elf Road, North Pole, 88888. That address is also in the story that we have on WKYC.com, and if you want to look for a letter that you've sent in, or if you want to adopt one that you can respond to fulfill one of those wishes, the website is USPSOperationSanta.com. Again, that's USPSOperationSanta.com, and that is linked in the story on our website on WKYC.com. All right, also keeping things local, the Russo brothers are not taking anything that Martin Scorsese has to say with anything more than a grain of salt. Joe and Anthony Russo are the people who are behind some of Hollywood's biggest box office hits, and they have directed some of the highest grossing films in history, including Avengers Endgame and Avengers Infinity War, part of which was shot here in Cleveland. But despite that success, they have still been criticized by their Hollywood peers. You know, they like to say, if you're doing something right, that's when you know the haters are going to come for you, right? Well, it was during an interview with Empire that Scorsese compared Marvel movies to a visit at a theme park and says that he doesn't even go see them. He said, and I quote, "That's not cinema. Honestly, the closest thing I can think of them, as well made as they are, with actors doing the best they can under the circumstances, is theme parks. It isn't the cinema of human beings trying to convey emotional, psychological experiences to another human being. That's what Scorsese said. Now, he's making these statements ahead of the Netflix debut of his new movie, The Irishman. That's starring Robert De Niro, Anna Paquin, Joe Pesci, Al Pacino, huge names. That's out on limited release in theaters right now. It debuts on Netflix on November 27th. So Joe Russo heard that, and he had been quiet, but he responded finally to the negative comments in an interview with The Hollywood Reporter on Sunday. This is what Joe Russo said. He said, "We define cinema as a film that can bring people together to have a shared emotional experience." He also said, "When we look at the box office of Avengers Endgame, we don't see that as a signifier of financial success. We see it as a signifier of emotional success." Now, that's directly taking up the issue that Scorsese said about them not conveying human emotion here. He went on to say, "It's a movie that had an unprecedented impact on audiences around the world in the way that they shared that narrative and the way that they experienced it and the emotions they felt watching it." So clearly, not in agreement with Scorsese that there's no emotional element to these kinds of films. Anthony Russo also chimed in, and he added, "The other way to think about it, too, is nobody owns cinema. We don't own cinema. We don't own cinema. You don't own cinema. Scorsese doesn't own cinema." So he's saying, can't be defined. It's undefinable, and they're not trying to define it, and they don't think Scorsese should try to define it either. Now, the Russo brothers are in town right now working on their latest movie, Cherry. In just a moment here, we're going to bring up Ben Axelrod. He is our sports analyst here at 3 News, and he's going to give us the latest update on the Myles Garrett suspension. If you don't know, which I don't know how it's possible that you couldn't know with everybody talking about this here in Cleveland, but Myles Garrett was suspended after he got into an altercation with Mason Rudolph in the Steelers game on Thursday night, ripped the helmet off of him. Now, Mason Rudolph, a lot of people are saying by and large started this. He tried to pull off Myles Garrett's helmet. You can see it in the film. And then some blows were thrown and all of that happened. So now here we are. We're in a situation where Myles Garrett is suspended. Ben Axelrod is here to talk to us about that. Thanks for joining us, Ben.
Of course.
So what's going on right now? He's got to have his hearing, right?
Yeah, he's appealing the suspension. Larry Ogunjobi, the Browns defensive tackle, who was suspended for 1 game, actually had his appeal today. So we should know that, if not today, probably tomorrow, what the decision is on Larry Ogunjobi. But yeah, Myles Garrett is obviously the headliner for all this, and he's appealing the suspension. He'll hear it Wednesday. Kind of an interesting nugget about it is he wants to be there in person to present his case. That doesn't usually happen with this. Usually, you have somebody from the NFL Players Association working on your behalf. But Myles Garrett, I would imagine, because of how big of a deal it is and, what's at stake as far as him being suspended for the rest of the year and perhaps beyond, wants to be there to state his case in person.
So what is particularly unique about this? I was doing a little bit of reading, and keep me honest on this if I'm wrong, but I saw someone say that typically part of Garrett's suspension was an indefinite suspension plus through the rest of this season, but that's not normal for something that happens in the field during a game. Is that right?
It's the second longest suspension ever for something that happened on the field, and as far as I know, it's the only one to be labeled as indefinite. Now, indefinite, is kind of up for interpretation. I think basically what it means in this case is before the NFL says, he's eligible to come back and play in 2020, we want to meet with him and see that he's contrite. And, I think that's probably something he can take care of at this hearing. I think, probably the most realistic outcome for all of this is the NFL drops the indefinite part of the suspension and just says Myles Garrett is suspended for the remainder of the 2019 season and potentially the playoffs, which is probably, when you consider everything at play, probably a pretty fair outcome for all involved. But this is, there was a player, Albert Hainsworth, in 2006, he actually stepped on another player's face with his cleat. He got 5 games for this. So if Garrett's suspension stands, at the very least it's 6 games. The longest suspension ever for something that happened on field is 12 games. That actually happened earlier this year with Vontaze Burfict, the linebacker for the Raiders. I don't think it was indefinite, though. I think it was just for the remainder of the season. So, but yeah, that's, obviously a very harsh punishment for Myles Garrett. And by the end of the week, we should know where it stands, finally.
And what's the public opinion on this? I know there have been a lot of people going back and forth. How's that stand right now?
Yeah, it's actually interesting. It's kind of shifting. I wouldn't say in Myles Garrett's favor per se, because I think everybody, agrees it was a terrible act and something that was punishable. And, if he winds up being suspended for the rest of the 2019 season, I think people will look at that as a generally fair suspension. But, there was a lot of outrage on Friday. It happened on Thursday night, and then you have the whole media cycle on Friday. It was the only game happening on Thursday night in the NFL. The Browns are, a big talking point nationally, just in terms of Baker Mayfield, Odell Beckham Jr., Jarvis Landry, the guys they have on their team. Myles Garrett goes out and does that. It fills the talk shows on Friday. It's all we talked about on Friday, all I wrote about all weekend and on Friday. But now, as we got to Sunday and there was more football to talk about, as people had time to digest this, it kind of settled down. I was watching the Fox pregame show, which has a lot of former players, older former players like Terry Bradshaw and Howie Long, more recent former players like Rob Gronkowski and Michael Vick and Tony Gonzalez and Michael Strahan. And to a man, they all, I wouldn't say that they defended Myles, but they kind of pushed back on the outrage that was coming from the traditional media. They were saying if you've never been in the trenches, you don't know what that's like. Rob Gronkowski recalled he was involved in an incident, it was either last year or 2 seasons ago, where he went at another player and kind of blindsided him and dropped a forearm on the back of his neck. Mm-hmm. He said in that moment he just blacked out and he knew immediately he was wrong. And he said, it was something where he was getting held all game and he had been getting held all season and the frustration just builds. Michael Strahan said that he's hit another player in the head with a helmet in practice before. And that, that's just, it's not defending it, but that's the way these things go. So I think there's been more, obviously in Cleveland, there's been a little more public opinion in Baker or in Myles Garrett's favor, but nationally even you're starting to see everybody kind of just calm down and look at this with a more even-keeled approach.
That's interesting to have that current player's perspective. I did see a tweet, but of course, as you said, this was all we were talking about on Friday. There was a player who had said he had seen this in practice.
Yeah.
It was Ryan Clark, who had won a Super Bowl with the Steelers in 2009. He'd seen it in practice, but not actually in a game.
Yeah.
So now he has an appeal to look forward to. You said that's on Wednesday.
Yes.
How quickly do you think that we'll get an answer on what this is going to look like for Garrett?
I would think Thursday or Friday, because I don't think they want this to bleed into the weekend. And, with appeals sometimes in other sports, if a player's appealing something on suspension, he's eligible to play until the appeal is heard. I don't think the NFL wants to deal with a scenario where Myles Garrett's suspension's up in the air. So, I think just because of how high profile this is, I think we'll have a decision by Friday at the latest.
And I know a lot of people were talking about how Mason Rudolph started it. There was that photo. We've got it on our website. Somebody here at a local Target took the stockings with the letters and spelled out Mason R. started it. Do you think that there's any chance that he gets more than the fine he's already been penalized with?
I think if he was going to be suspended, that would have already come down. That would have been the initial punishment, and he could appeal it down from there. But there's really no precedent for handing out one punishment and then coming back and giving him an even tougher one. So I think he got a fine. It's debatable. I've seen people make strong cases for him being suspended. I think. I don't think anything he did warranted a suspension other than what, if you're under the belief he started it and there's a lot of evidence to suggest that, then you could argue that he's the one who started what wound up being a really ugly scene. But I don't think anything he did to Myles necessarily warranted a suspension.
Something else that we saw today just recently is that the Browns-Steelers game that's going to be played in Pittsburgh in 2 weeks on December 1st, that got moved to 1 p.m. Does that have anything to do with this controversy?
In theory it could. The main reason it got moved was that 4:25 CBS slot's like a primetime slot basically, even though it's not technically a primetime game, but that's usually a national showcase game. And, when the NFL schedule came out, the assumption would be it's Browns-Steelers. If we're not going to have it on Sunday night or Monday night, and it was just on a Thursday night, so it's already been on a national television game, but let's give it this national spotlight. Well, the Browns are 4-6. The Steelers are 5-5. The Steelers don't have their starting quarterback. Meanwhile, the game that got flexed into that 4 p.m. slot is the Chiefs versus the Raiders. The Raiders are a West Coast team. Both of those teams are playing better than both the Browns and the Steelers at this point. That game could have implications for first place in the AFC West. I just think all things considered, it probably is just the more appealing game at this point. And then when you factor in, hey, let's not put, in a national spotlight game, let's not be replaying, Myles Garrett swinging Mason Rudolph's helmet at him. I'm sure that conversation was had.
I mean, that's 3.5 less hours of tailgating time.
Right.
If you're thinking about rowdy Browns and Steelers fans.
Well, and that's the thing about it. This is the weekend after Thanksgiving. Ohio State, Michigan the day before. A really busy week for everybody involved.
Okay, well, I'm definitely looking forward to catching that game. So we will be without one of the Browns players this Sunday against the Dolphins, unless something happens with his appeal of the suspension.
Yeah, I mean, at the very least, you're looking at no Larry Ogunjobi and no Myles Garrett at this point. But if Larry Ogunjobi's appeal gets overturned, and I've been looking, and I'm going to write about this for WKYC.com, if you look at just the history of the NFL overturning things like this, usually it happens with these smaller suspensions. Usually it's one game gets turned into a fine or 2 games gets turned into 1 game. So that's maybe why I'm a little more pessimistic about Myles Garrett coming back at some point this season. But I could definitely see a scenario where Larry Ogunjobi's out there playing on the field on Sunday.
Okay, well, we'll keep a look on that, and we'll definitely watch for that story on WKYC.com from Ben. Thank you, Ben.
Thank you.
I appreciate it. All right, as we continue to look forward to what is happening this week, the impeachment inquiry hearings will continue, and there are a lot of big names who will be seeing this week. We have 4 people expected to testify tomorrow on Tuesday, 3 people on Wednesday, and then the last public testimony in a hearing will be on Thursday. Here's something that's very interesting. President Donald Trump has actually suggested that he may testify. He tweeted in part, "Even though I did nothing wrong," this is a quote, "even though I did nothing wrong and don't like giving credibility to this no due process hoax, I like the idea and will, in order to get Congress focused again, strongly consider it." This is after Trump was saying that there was not due process because he didn't have an opportunity to speak his case in these impeachment inquiry hearings, and was then invited by Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi, who had made a comment that rather than tweeting while the hearings are going on, he should come in and have his say under oath at the hearings. So there's that. I think that'll be very interesting to see if Trump does actually either show up in person or present written testimony to be read at the impeachment inquiry hearings this coming week. That may or may not happen, but here's what is scheduled to happen at this point. There are 4 people who are scheduled to testify on Tuesday. At 9 a.m. Eastern, we're expected to hear Lieutenant Colonel Alexander S. Vindman, and this is the top Ukraine expert for the National Security Council. Also in that time slot is Jennifer Williams, who is an aide to Vice President Mike Pence. And then tomorrow at 2:30 p.m. Eastern, we're expected to hear Kurt D. Volker, who is the former U.S. Special Envoy to Ukraine, as well as Timothy Morrison, a Europe and Russia expert for the National Security Council. Now, according to the New York Times, 3 of those people, Colonel Vindman, Williams, and Morrison, all listened in real time to the July phone call between President Donald Trump and Ukraine's president that is the center of this impeach inquiry. It's during that call where it said that Trump brought up investigations of his political rivals and the issue of whether or not there was a quid pro quo presented where an investigation was called for in exchange for not withholding military aid, which is the basis of this impeachment inquiry hearing. On Wednesday, we are expected to hear 3 people testify in public hearings. At 9 a.m. Eastern, Gordon D. Sondland, the U.S. ambassador to the European Union, is scheduled to testify. And then at 2:30 p.m. Eastern, we're expected to hear from Laura K. Cooper, who is the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Russian, Ukrainian, and Eurasian Affairs, as well as David Hale, the Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs. According to the New York Times, Sondland had direct contact with Trump and has already informed the committee that he told a top Ukrainian official that the country would probably have to give Trump a public pledge for investigations before it would receive that frozen military aid that we just talked about. Then finally, on Thursday, the last public testimony in these impeachment inquiry hearings is expected at 9 a.m. from Fiona Hill, the National Security Council's former senior director for Europe and Russia. According again to the New York Times, Hill had a front row seat to what she called a nightmare, quote, situation, where she said private interests were put above the nation's interest. She's expected to provide testimony that John R. Bolton, who is the president's former national security advisor and her boss, was deeply alarmed by what happened during that entire situation. All right, now to end things on a positive note here, we have our weekly segment called We Know You Can. This is where we give you your weekly dose of Monday motivation. This is where we want to talk about what you're working on or working through or could use maybe a little extra inspiration to knock out of the park. Maybe it's something that you've already nailed and you want to let us know so that we can give you a digital high five and some props and a good job on that. Or maybe you want to shout out somebody else for all the hard work that they're doing. This is the place to do that. Or maybe also if you just have a favorite inspirational quote to share. That's what I'm going to share with you today, one of my favorite inspirational quotes. The quote is, "The best way out is always through." This is a quote by Robert Frost. It's in his poem Servant of Servants. And it's akin to that phrase, if you're going through something, keep on going. The fastest, quickest way to get through whatever it is you're dealing with is just to keep on keeping on and get through it because there is light at the end of the tunnel. That's a quote that I try to keep in mind when I'm going through tough times. On Instagram, user D Tardivo sent in a quote that he particularly likes. It's, "Stay hungry, stay foolish." Now, if you're not familiar, this was said by the late Apple co-founder and CEO Steve Jobs during his Stanford graduation commencement speech, June 12th, 2005. And because there is no feat too small for a little Monday motivation, Twitter user Chelsea Earlywine said she wants a little motivation to deal with the mound of clothes that she's been staring at for the last week on her couch. She wants us all to send her some strength to put them away and pack for her next trip, which is coming up in just a couple of days. Girl, I hear you. I got a stack of laundry in my closet too, and I could use some motivation for that as well. All right, this is our We Know You Can segment. We appreciate you sending in what you'd like a little extra inspiration on. We'll keep doing this every Monday. We hope that you are enjoying it. Thank you so much for joining us here on 3 News Now. If you haven't already, make sure you download our 3 News app in your app store, whatever platform it is that you decide to use, and also like us here on Facebook. Follow our page and subscribe if you don't already to our YouTube channel. Make sure you click the bell so you get a notification every single time we go live and you don't miss any of our 3 News Now updates. Thanks for joining us here today. I'll see you back tomorrow. I'm Stephanie Haney.